Welcome to the Empowered Women Life Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Karen Bashford. This podcast is for every woman who has ever felt limited by her past, silenced by trauma, or held back by society's expectations. Each week, we will share powerful stories, expert insights, and practical tools to help you become the leader of your own life.
Today, I want to welcome Sally Panks. Sally was somebody I had the pleasure of listening to at a networking meeting as the speaker. And for me, what she shared was something that I feel has to be acknowledged through this podcast, if nothing else. Sally is a lady with a shocking story, one that may well resonate with many of you, not because of what happened to her, but how a devastating call from her child's school changed everything. So much that perhaps it's something none of us would ever want to face. But the outcome has been something that is going to enable so many to benefit. So Sally, welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for having me.
Please tell us a bit about yourself and what happened on that phone call.
Okay, thank you. So, as Karen says, my name's Sally Panks. I live in Norfolk, just an ordinary family, ordinary life, until one day I received a phone call from the head teacher from my daughter's primary school. She was 11 at the time, telling me that she'd been self-harming in the girls' changing rooms. At that time, I didn't even know what self-harm was. It came as a complete blow. It literally knocked us off our feet, and it was hard. It was a really, really difficult, hard time.
So when you say self-harm, obviously we can all imagine what that means, but there's different kinds of self-harm. So
yeah, there's
can
many.
you explain?
Yeah, there's many forms of self-harm. I always refer to cutting because that is kind of the most relatable. But it can be anything from scratching, biting, nipping, punching yourself, burning, cutting. It can even be things that people swallow and consume. So it can be a multitude of things, from pulling hair, anything, basically anything that causes pain or harm.
They must be absolutely in a place of despair to actually physically harm themselves.
Yes, I mean, generally there is a point in somebody's life that is a trigger for obviously mental and emotional distress, which is generally what leads people to self-harm. In my daughter's case, it was undiagnosed ADHD and autism. She was struggling in school. She struggled with friendship. She had done for many, many years, and she was actually on the waiting list for assessment. But in Norfolk, it's a 6-year wait. So the assessment was basically, it came too late. Had she have been diagnosed and medicated when she was put on the waiting list, maybe our outcome and our story would have been different. But by the age of 11, obviously the hormones were starting to kick in, and she basically had a complete breakdown, and self-harm was her coping strategy. Many people say to me that almost the physical pain takes away the emotional pain. There's lots of theories behind why people self-harm and how it helps. But just briefly, the science behind it is, when somebody self-harms and inflicts that pain on themselves, it releases endorphins in the brain, and these endorphins are the body's natural relaxant and painkiller. So when somebody self-harms, initially for the first 5 to 30 minutes, they have a period of calm and relaxation where they actually feel content. But then unfortunately, when these endorphins wear off, they then generally feel a lot of self-loathe, regret, guilt, and obviously the underlying issue is kind of still there. And then the need kind of builds up again, and then the self-harm happens, the endorphin releases, they get the come down, and it just goes around in a cycle. So it's really, what we try and do is break that cycle of self-harm.
So basically, and I should imagine this happens a lot in loads of hospitals or areas, that because of the lack of, what's the word I want, opportunities to be assessed as soon as possible, there are going to be people, children particularly, who are going to try to help themselves in a way that is devastatingly painful, I would have thought, because cutting yourself must be horrendous.
Yeah, but it's almost that kind of feeling of empowerment and control. I mean, like as an adult, if we have a bad day, perhaps we'd have a glass of wine or maybe a cigarette. We know that they're bad for us, and generally we can limit it in moderation and it's helpful. But obviously, for a young person, drinking alcohol or having a cigarette isn't an option, so they tend to find something else. And with the internet nowadays, the internet is a wonderful thing. Obviously, Karen, we wouldn't have met if it wasn't for the internet, and it's fantastic. And my business wouldn't be where it is today without the reach of social media. But when it's abused and used wrongly, it can be absolutely devastating to the point where children are learning how to self-harm through YouTube videos and sort of platforms like that. So, that's when it's really difficult. And, I used to monitor my daughter's phone, but, kids are clever. They know how to hide these things. They know how to delete, history and that type of thing. So yeah, it's and actually, it's a myth that it is just a young person's coping strategy. I support lots of adults as well, even in their 60s, 70s. But sadly, the youngest person I've supported has been 5.
5?
5, yeah. And generally, self-harm starts to kind of show the first signs and symptoms from around about the age of 8. I mean, obviously, my daughter was 11 when I found out, and self-harm was completely new to me. But now that I've done obviously lots of training, lots of research, the lived experience, I now recognize that when she was probably around the age of 8, she was starting to show the first signs by biting, nipping, just very subtle little things. So part of what I do in my work is to try and get the distraction kits that I make into primary schools to try and nip self-harm in the bud before it does become an issue, and teach children healthier coping strategies and safer alternatives.
I just had a thought. So if somebody is actually sits and chews their fingernails and all the skin around, that would be a form of self-harming, wouldn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And nail biting is actually, we don't associate it as self-harm because lots and lots of people do it. But yeah, it is. And also, I mean, like my mum, when she walks into a room, just say she's going to a community centre or something, she will actually dig her nails into her hand. She clenches her fists and digs her nails into her hand. And that again is a form of self-harm because she's thinking about the pain in her hand rather than thinking about the nervousness and the anxiety she's feeling walking into that environment. So, again, a lot of it is to overcome the reality of actually the true feeling. And we find as well with a lot of children and young people, they don't actually understand their feelings. So actually, how can they verbalize it to an adult when they don't even understand why they're feeling what they're feeling themselves? So, that's where self-harm can really then sort of play the part, because they don't know what's going on with themselves. All they know is that they feel different, they feel uncomfortable, something may have happened within the family, And, so yeah, I mean, there's a million reasons why somebody could start to self-harm, but recognizing the signs is really, really important.
So what would you say to a parent perhaps that is starting to see those signs? What would you say to them?
So I would just say, try not to be judgmental. Obviously, you can show that child that you're kind of upset about the situation, but the mistake that I made with my daughter was that when I found out that she was self-harming, I went into her bedroom and I actually kind of begged her to stop. And then I started to get upset. I started to cry. She started to cry. And actually, like I mentioned before, the cycle of self-harm, I'm then putting my emotion onto her already sort of self-loathe and that guilt that she knows that when she self-harms, she then feels more guilty because she knows that I won't like it. I mean, every child, every family setup is different, and that was counterproductive. For other children, maybe knowing that their parent is going to be upset about it, that might be a hindrance. But the general rule is that if somebody is determined to self-harm, they will self-harm. It's not something that they can necessarily control. It's an urge that just has to be followed through, unfortunately.
Yes, and I suppose for me, I did bite my nails. I was terrible. But I now can see why I did it, because basically I felt as if I wasn't good enough to be in my family,
Yes.
because I never got told that I was loved or I wasn't given a hug. It was always just get on and do things, kind of such. So I suppose because we tend to just try and ignore our feelings, even as adults, added to that the fact that your daughter was ADHD and autistic, that probably makes it even worse, because definitely from what I understand of autism, it's not a way of understanding feelings necessarily.
Yeah, and and the autistic world is very black and white. They often know that they're slightly different, and let's face it, everybody, especially a young person, a child, they want to fit in. They want to be accepted, be just like everybody else. And of course, they're not, and they're incredible in their own right. There's nothing wrong with it. But as a child, it can have a real detriment on your self-esteem and your confidence and how you feel about yourself. And so, I mean, 50% of neurodivergent individuals actually self-harm. So it's very, very common in the ADHD, autistic kind of world, any sort of mental health conditions that way. It's very common also in the LGBTQ community, 2/3, because obviously they face a huge amount of stigma. They're trying to get their heads around what's sort of going on with them. And I just think, as adults, we don't have to understand, but just be kind. They get so much judgment. And of course, suicide is the biggest killer of men under 40 in the UK. 50% of all people that die by suicide have a history of self-harm. So actually, it's really, really common. It's just hidden because there's so much stigma and shame. Nobody wants to talk about it, and it is so easy to hide.
Well, yeah, because when you spoke about it at the networking meeting, I was obviously aware of self-harm simply because of the nature of the women I work with who have been through abuse and trauma. But I hadn't realised quite how bad it was. And the stats you're sharing are astronomical, really, when you consider. But as you say, it's hidden. You don't know anything about it. Do you want to
Yeah, I
pause?
mean, the figures say that 1 in 15 young people self-harm, but that's the ones that we know about. So many people talk to me and say they self-harmed for a long period of time, and they never told a soul because you can hide it under, sleeves and trousers. I mean, in the summer, it's harder to hide. My business increases quite a lot in the summer because people then start to notice sort of wounds and scars. But even then, self-harmers are very, very clever, and they will do their injuries where people can't see them.
So they must also be very clever in the sense of, because I would assume some of the cuts can be quite deep.
Yeah, and
So
and that's again a lot of, you know, the part of my kits is I put together several different kits, but the original kit that I put together contains first aid and an instruction leaflet, because if somebody is determined to self-harm, they will self-harm. So it's really important that that person knows how to manage their wounds and look after them, keep them clean, keep them obviously infection-free, because infection can lead to sepsis. You can even nerve damage. You can, you know, even get to the point where you lose a limb if it gets that bad. So it is really important that, you know, people know how to manage a wound. And a lot of young people and children don't know basic first aid. So actually sometimes they may be a regular cutter, and one time they may just accidentally cut too deep, and they just go into panic mode because they don't know how to deal with it. I've had messages in the middle of the night asking for help because they've messed up. And so, you know, I've kind of talked them through wound care at 2 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, and then get them off to A&E the next day. But yeah, wound care is a crucial part of anybody that, you know, is a self-harmer.
so tell us a bit about these kits, because that's, I felt, was something that was absolutely crucial in the way that we now approach the issue, because having become aware, there has to be something that can help, and your kits do that.
Yes, they do. So when I received the phone call from school, obviously because it was at school, it was a safeguarding issue. And we had social services come and work with us as a family, and they were excellent, but you only get them for a number of weeks and then you're kind of signed off. But I can remember she said to me, Sally, you need to put a kit together for her. She might as well have been talking in a foreign language, because when you are going through that trauma, that fear, that upset, that worry, you can't think rationally. And it probably took me 18 months before I could even go to a chemist and buy a plaster, because it's too much.
Mm.
So a few years on, obviously I'd done lots of research, we'd got our heads around what was going on, and I thought I'm going to put some kits together to support other families trying to navigate their self-harm journey. So basically, the kits, all the kits have the basic fundamental that they rely on what's called the delay and replace strategy. So if somebody wants to self-harm, if you can delay their mindset for as little time as 30 to 45 seconds, they're less likely to injure. I normally say cut, but whatever injury it is. So the kits contain alternatives to self-harm that still release that same endorphins. So they contain elastic bands that you can flick on your skin, because obviously it stings. There's ice cube molds in there. So you put the ice cube molds in the freezer, you can hold them in your hand. Obviously you get that cold ache, or you can rub them on the skin where you want to injure. Again, that is because of that pain, that endorphin release, which is, like I said before, the body's natural painkiller and relaxant. So we're trying to mimic that same sensation as what somebody gets when they self-harm. One of the theories with self-harm as well is that it's the kind of the self-care and the nurturing afterwards. So all the kits contain red pen, so that the self-harmer can draw a mock wound. They can then dress it, plaster it, bandage it as if it's a real wound, and then they have the satisfaction of that self-care. The kits contain a journal, so obviously writing down thoughts and feelings. Lots of therapists and life coaches recommend journaling, you know, writing down your positives, worries, fears, getting it out. Every kit again contains a stress ball. The kits that I've produced that go from around the age of 8 into primary schools contain lots of fiddle and fidget toys, relaxation, regulation items, little sort of cards that say you are awesome, just trying to make them feel good about themselves, pocket hugs, that type of thing. And the kits for people that actually do self-harm contain obviously the first aid items as well.
So tell us about your daughter now then.
So she's 16 in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
She has been self-harm free for about 2 years now. I'd be lying if I said it was an easy road, because obviously she was struggling for a good 2 to 3 years, because unfortunately self-harm does become an addiction. And like any addiction, recovery is never linear, and you often get relapses and good days and bad days. But there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel. I would be lying if I said if your child is self-harming, buy a kit, it's a magic wand. It's not a magic wand. It's another tool in the toolbox to assist recovery. Therapy, counseling, life coaching can be crucial to obviously get to the bottom of the underlying issues. Like I said before, my daughter's trigger, a lot of that was school. She actually got to the point where she couldn't attend school. So she actually does private tutoring to get her through her GCSEs rather than going into school. So sometimes you have to, again, put your child's mental health before the system that we're programmed to, be bullied to follow. I'm not saying that all parents should take their children out of school. I'm not saying that at all. But in some circumstances like ours, it made a huge difference that, where she was being sick every morning before school because she had such anxiety, her weight dropped. Obviously, we had the self-harm, and it got to the point where I was like, we just can't carry on like this. So something had to give. And taking her out of school was one of the big things that assisted in her recovery. But definitely for any parents out there that listen to this are thinking, I'm in that situation, there is light at the end of the tunnel. The cycle can be broken. It takes a lot of work. The person who is self-harming they have to want to stop.
Yeah.
Because like if you're a smoker, you were told to give up, you'd only give up if you wanted to give up. So they have to be in the right headspace as well, but with the right support, certainly they can get there. And a lot of work that I do as well is actually with parents and families, because I get it, I know how hard it is. So it's not all about the person that self-harms, it's the whole ripple effect around it, and I try and sort of support everybody.
Okay. So my question for you is, because you're talking about the child and obviously the situation and the help that's available, how did it impact your family?
It was really difficult. Luckily, my eldest daughter had left home at that point, and I didn't tell her too much of what was going on. It had a massive effect on my marriage. Luckily, we got through it, but it did nearly break us. It had a massive effect on my mental health. I ended up needing to seek help and advice from my GP. I ended up on antidepressants. And again, what I say to parents is you need to look after yourself, because you cannot look after your child if you're broken. So even that little bit of self-care, reaching out for support is so, so important for an adult. And I didn't have anywhere to go because there wasn't a me out there then who would, somebody that you could turn to that gets it. And I didn't want to talk to my mum about it because the emotions were so raw that I knew that she would be upset, and I couldn't carry her upset as well as my own. So, just it was really hard, really dark. It was the hardest thing that I've ever had to go through.
You say that social services stepped in initially because it was safeguarding issues. What happens when they disappear? Is there any facilities, unless you actually physically pay for them, that's available?
So we did get referred to CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. There's 2-year waiting list. So
Okay.
again, unless they're actually at a real crisis point, which is kind of suicide, you don't generally get seen, and then it's 2 weeks later, and by then often it's past. What I would say to parents is that if you feel you cannot keep your child safe, is go straight to A&E. We've been to A&E on numerous occasions when she's had a complete meltdown and I haven't known what to do with her. And they do have, although it takes a while because they're not necessarily in-house, but they will get child psychologists and things, and that, the pediatric support in there for your child. And even as an adult, if you feel you can't keep yourself safe, A&E 100% all the time, 999, or if you're concerned, dial 111. 111 do actually have option 2 mental health services. I personally have never used it. I can't say how good or how bad it is. I have no personal experience of it, but it is an option that is there as well. But definitely reach out to emergency services if you are at the point where you just feel you can't keep your young person or yourself safe.
In an ideal world, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would like to see self-harm not be a thing, but let's be realistic. It's always going to be there. I would like to see schools having more education around self-harm. Once a year they do their safeguarding training and they probably touch on the subject, but nobody is actually trained to deal with it specifically. So actually just having a kit in the school is a real good conversation opener. Teachers, the pupil, and even parents can go through the kits together, have a conversation about each individual part of the kit, particularly the alternatives, and how they can help. And it's just having these open conversations so that children don't feel as if it's their dirty secret, because that's when it's dangerous, when it's hidden.
Yeah. Do you actually give talks or anything like that in schools or anything?
If I can get a foot in the door, I feel, I may be wrong, but I feel as if schools tend to think it doesn't happen in my school, where it happens in every school. They don't want to have that bad reputation, I guess. Like I
Well,
say, I could be wrong.
it's part of life, though.
It
A
is, it
child's
is,
mental health is part of life,
yeah.
so surely
You
they
know,
can't ignore that.
that's again what I'm trying to open up. I run a scheme where local businesses can sponsor their local school. So it's £30 and then they nominate which school and I send 3 kits in. I always contact the school before I send the kits and explain who I am, what we do, what the kits are. And I say to them, if you would rather not receive the kits, please let me know. I haven't had one school refuse yet. I think probably over 130 kits have gone into schools so far.
Well, that's minimal when you consider how many schools there
Yeah,
are.
exactly. And I'm in the process of trying to get kind of funding and grants to to do this. That is my absolute aim, is to get kits into schools, to open up the conversations. And yes, I'm happy to go into schools, but generally it's.
This is your opportunity. What would you ask for if you could?
I would ask if anybody can donate, even 50p, please donate, because we run lots of schemes where we give kits away for free to people facing financial hardship. Just have conversations with people. Let's be open about it. Self-harm, unfortunately, is a thing. It is in society. And the more we talk about it, the more we can spread awareness. And then hopefully lots of these people that are struggling, we can get it nipped in the bud.
On that note, I will say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm sure that this is going to encourage more to consider the reality of children's mental health and self-harm. So yes, and for that matter, even adults. So thank you, Sally, for coming on. I will ensure that connection to you are shared on the actual details when the podcast goes live. Is there anything you want to finish with?
Be kind, be safe, be happy. That's it. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Karen. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And you take care.
Thank you.